Alright, in this video we're going to take a look at division and continue our Civil War studies. And we're going to look at how did we finally go to war? What pushed us to divide? So again, it starts with the West and our fight over how is slavery going to expand? How is that going to work? And so Stephen Douglas was a Northerner. He's a Northern Democrat from Illinois. And from the Senate, he proposed popular sovereignty. The idea that let the states and let the territories decide for themselves. Let the people living there decide for themselves. That takes the pressure off Congress. And so that if people want slavery in that area, they'll vote for slavery. So the residents themselves would decide the issue. And so the next big state that started to have enough people was the Kansas-Nebraska territory, this territory over here. And especially and he proposed dividing it up. So Kansas, this area, could become a state, and it likely would have been a slave state. The soil, the weather is good enough for plantations, whereas Nebraska, it's too far north, it's too cold, and the soil's not as good. And so this would be a free state, this would likely be a slave state, would keep the balance, but it is expanding slavery, and it's breaking the old Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise said that this was the line where this would be the slave states, these would be the free states. This breaks that rule, says, nope, let the people decide for themselves. Congress passes the law, so let's see what happens in Kansas. Oh, it's a mess. And so supporters for and against slavery pour into the state trying to win the vote over slavery. And Northern Reverend Henry Ward Beecher raised money to supply Northern settlers with rifles to defend themselves and possibly even more. And they'd call them Beecher's Bibles. And so they're sending in guns on both sides. As the election neared, a group of pro-slavery border ruffians came from Missouri to cross into Kansas to illegally win the vote. And so a bunch of people that didn't even live in Kansas started to cross over to vote for slavery. And so this led to a disputed vote. And people were debating, well, was that a good election? Was it fair? And so eventually they just set up two competing governments, a pro-slavery government and an anti-slavery government in the state. Nebraska wasn't even an issue, they're too far north, and they didn't have the population yet. And so you've got people that are ready to fight on both sides, pro-slavery people, anti-slavery people, moving in to this single state. This becomes the early battleground. Abolitionist John Brown moves to Kansas and leads a group, and mostly his own family, to kill 5 pro-slavery men. And they're actually killed with swords. They're chopped up in their own front yards at Pottawatomie Creek. And so John Brown here becomes a fugitive. He's on the run for going out and murdering pro-slavery people. And he just kind of starts it. He becomes the most notorious, but over 200 people die in Kansas, back and forth, pro-slavery and then anti-slavery revenge. And so this is a mural in the Kansas State Capitol kind of showing the start of this fight, starting with John Brown, but ultimately the state gets very bloody. Eventually, as far as Kansas statehood, by 1857 they have enough people to officially apply for statehood. And the anti-slavery Free Soilers wanted to have a free state, and the pro-slavery people wanted to have their own state. So the pro-slavery people write up their own constitution, the Lecompton Constitution. That's the name of the city where they wrote it. And they wanted to keep their own slavery. So they submit that to Congress. Congress rejects this constitution. Kansas kind of stays in limbo until the war actually starts. When the war starts, now that the North is in charge, the North makes it a free state in 1861. Meanwhile, around the same time, things are getting bloody back in Washington, D.C. Abolitionist senator from the North, Charles Sumner, makes a speech condemning pro-slavery men and specifically insulting some of the congressmen from South Carolina. In response, one of the congressmen from the South stands up to defend somebody that Sumner attacked in that speech. And so he stands up and beats Sumner with a cane multiple times in the head, leaving some pretty nasty head wounds that take Sumner years to recover. Brooks, however, was given canes as gifts and helped to raise funds for his campaign. And so Brooks really didn't hurt from this. And so we're starting to see bloody fights in Kansas, out in the West, and in Washington, D.C. We also see some new political parties rise up as we get new issues as we change. And so the landscape had changed. The Whigs was the former major party, and the Whig Party just died out. They split between the North and the South. Northern Whigs didn't want slavery, Southern Whigs wanted slavery. They split apart so they could never win an election again, and they died out. Lincoln used to be a Whig. But after that, he was kind of without a party for a bit. The Democrats also started to see the same thing. The Democrats also started to split over slavery again between the North and the South. We also got a new political party, the American Party, also known as the Know Nothing Party. They support nativism, which means they are very much anti-immigrant. And so they didn't want any more Irish or German immigration. There were these Irish Catholics, Germans were taking over the country, that they weren't speaking English, that they were changing what it meant to be American. And so largely this was the anti-immigrant party. They're known as the Know-Nothings because they would go out and just beat up these immigrants. When the cops said anything, they'd say they didn't know anything. And so this is a largely racist party, very strong in places where immigration was strong, especially New York. But eventually, Republicans started to rise up as this new party that would replace the Whigs. And so opponents of slavery in the territories, they formed their own Republican Party. They ran for president in 1856, John C. Fremont, kind of the main leader of one of the leaders in the Mexican Revolt and kind of the main general in California, was their first candidate. As the party grew, it took on elements of other parties. It took on Free Soilers. It took some of the Northern Democrats and Whigs, and even some of the Know-Nothings, but largely it was just a Northern party. And Northern Democrats, and because they were still too weak, they lost a few elections. And so a Northern Democrat, James Buchanan, won the election of 1856 with promise of unity, in that he was a Northern Democrat, but he was very much not looking to fight slavery at all. And he had a lot of strong ties to Southerners and to slavery, even if he was a Northerner. Dred Scott, to make things more complicated, Dred Scott was a slave who had lived in a free area. And so the question is, if a master takes his slaves and lives in a northern area, are those slaves still slaves? If slavery is illegal in an area and a master brings his slaves, are those slaves now free? Can a master bring his slave anywhere? So it's a complicated issue. 1857, the Supreme Court rules against Dred Scott, saying even though Dred Scott, here he is, was brought into a northern state, he's still a slave. And the whole idea is property, and John Locke and all that, saying that the Constitution says that you get to keep your property. And if slaves are property, you should be able to bring your property anywhere. And so slaves do not have the same rights of citizens. They are considered property. And Congress cannot forbid slavery in territories. It also really opens up a can of worms saying, well, you can have slavery anywhere then. If the government can't take your slaves, why can't I have slavery in the North too? So it really challenges. All these compromises we made are just out the window now. And in these debates, we had a few debates about this issue. And nationwide, even though this was just in Illinois, this was watched very closely because these two people were really becoming the leaders of their party. In 1858, it's just a race for a Senate seat in Illinois was hotly contested between Republican Abraham Lincoln and Democrat Stephen Douglas. And this became a huge debate. It's over multiple cities across the state as they were trying to become senators. And the topic was slavery in the territories. Should it expand? Douglas's, the little giant here, his big idea was popular sovereignty. Let the territories decide. And Lincoln kind of rejects the Supreme Court ruling and says, nope, we need to actually pass laws to stop the spread of slavery. And so very strong debates. This, in the end, Douglas still wins, but this allows Lincoln to become a rising star in the party and across America, leading to an election 2 years later. And so it's a messy election with really multiple parties running at once. And so Republicans run Abraham Lincoln. And his big thing is no slavery in the territories. The Democrats, they split in half, which is really their death. Northern Democrats, led by Stephen Douglas over here, and they say popular sovereignty, just let the states decide for themselves. Southern Democrats say, nope, expand slavery, more and more slavery. And there's even this weird little fourth party that just says, can't we all get along? and they don't really mention anything about slavery. Let's just make a deal. Let's get along. And so nobody votes for this guy really. And the Democrats are split. They don't know where to go, which way to go. And so the Republicans, even though they're a new party and they're only in the North, they win. And so if the Democrats were united, they would have won easily. However, because the Democrats split in half between North and South, the Republicans win. And Lincoln wins with less than half the popular vote and no votes from the South. And so kind of here's the results. Lincoln only winning in the northern free states. Okay, Southern Democrats are winning in the deep slave states. John Bell, this kind of constitutional union guy that says, can't we all just get along? He wins there. And Stephen Douglas only wins here. And so Stephen Douglas, well, he wins a little bit there, but he's not winning much. And so in the end, Lincoln wins, largely because he gets the most populous states, the states with the most people. That's where he wins. And so it looks like Lincoln didn't win that much, but he won the most populous states with the most electoral votes. And so he's very much strategizing here. Hey, if the Democrats would have gotten together, they would have beaten him. But they didn't. Lincoln's victory scares the South. An anti-slavery president. We haven't had a true anti-slavery president up to that point. We'd had Northern presidents, but they were never actively against the expansion of slavery. They didn't fight it that hard. And so the South decides, Lincoln's going to end slavery. We need to leave. We're going to go form our own country. And the South Carolinians are the first to secede in December of 1860, before Lincoln's even president. What did the current president do? Yeah, he didn't do anything. And so the president before Lincoln desperately tried to stop everybody. Even in the Senate, they passed the Crittenden Compromise. And they introduced legislation saying, we're going to keep your slavery. Don't run away. Slavery's safe. And the South says, no, we don't trust you. Bye. Southern delegates meet in February. And so all these blue states, they leave before Lincoln's even in office. And they form their own country, the Confederate States of America, with a leader, the senator from Mississippi, Jefferson Davis, becomes president, and we are now two countries, the Confederate States of America, the United States of America, and we kind of have these iffy border states where they're not sure which way they're going to go. And when the war starts, ultimately these states in gray, they leave, and these kind of awkward states, they decide to stay with the North, even though they had slavery. And so the war starts.